Welcome to AERO 2230 ProPilot 1, presentation number 13 on Federal Aviation Regulations. This presentation will review all of the Federal Aviation Regulations that apply to you as a private pilot. We'll go over some of the most important regulations and discuss how they apply and how you as a PIC should comply. The Federal Aviation Regulations are divided into different parts. Part 61, Part 91, Part 23, Part 43. They all refer to different types of regulations. It's important for you to understand which regulations apply to you as a private pilot, and also it's important for you to understand how to interpret them and then comply with them. Part 1 of the Federal Aviation Regulations contains all the definitions and abbreviations that you'll see in the rest of the Federal Aviation Regulations. So if you have a question about an abbreviation or a definition, Part 1 is the place to go. The Federal Aviation Administration website, FAA.gov, has some very useful tools for looking up the Federal Aviation Regulations. All you need to do is click on Regulations and Policies, and then in the drop-down, click on FAA Regulations. And it'll bring you right to the FARs, or the Federal Aviation Regulations. On the right side, you can see you can click on different parts, Part 61, Part 91, or just look up FARs. And then over here you see a list, and let's go to Part 1. Part 1 is definitions and abbreviations. So we can click on Part 1, and you can see there's general definitions, abbreviations and symbols, rules of construction. So let's just look at general definitions. General definitions, as used in subchapters A through K of this chapter, unless the context requires otherwise. Administrator means the Federal Aviation Administrator or any person to whom he has delegated his authority in the matter concerned. And then you can see there are definitions of just about everything that you'll see in the Federal Aviation Regulations. Part 43 is the part of the Federal Aviation Regulations that details inspection requirements for aircraft. And a general aviation aircraft is required to have at least an annual inspection once every year. If an aircraft is for hire, in other words, if you are renting an aircraft or if an aircraft is used for charter operations, that aircraft, in addition to an annual inspection, needs a 100-hour inspection. So every 100 hours, that aircraft needs to be inspected. MTSU's aircraft actually get an inspection every 50 hours in order to do oil changes, because the MTSU aircraft are used very heavily for flight instruction. We can see Part 43 on the FAA website by clicking 1 through 59 and then scrolling down till we get to Part 43. Part 43, Maintenance, Preventive Maintenance, Rebuilding, and Alteration. So if we click on that, we can look at all the regulations that apply to maintenance, preventive maintenance, so on and so forth. Part 61 of the Federal Aviation Regulations lists all of the requirements to be certified as a pilot, certified flight instructor, and even ground instructors. All of the certificates and the requirements for those certificates are listed, starting with recreational pilots, private pilots, up through commercial pilots, airline transport pilots. And if you're interested in knowing what is required to be certified for one of those certificates, Part 61 is the place to go. Part 61 also lists requirements for medical certificates and also the duration of each of the medical certificates, Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. Remember, medical certificates always expire at the end of the month in which they were issued. Part 61 also lists requirements for different type ratings. A type rating is required for different types of aircraft, like large aircraft, which are defined as aircraft that are heavier than 12,500 pounds, any turbojet-powered aircraft, or any other aircraft deemed by the administrator to require a type rating. Part 6131 lists the requirements to be certified to fly a complex airplane. A complex airplane is defined as an airplane that has retractable landing gear, movable flaps, and a constant speed propeller. The Diamond DA-40 is not a complex airplane because it has fixed landing gear. Landing gear cannot be retracted. So if you get your license in a Diamond DA-40 and you've never flown any other aircraft, you would need to receive and log ground and flight training from a certified flight instructor and receive an endorsement from that certified flight instructor in order to be qualified to fly a complex airplane. 6131 also lists requirements to fly a high-performance airplane. A high-performance airplane is an aircraft that has more than 200 horsepower. The Diamond DA-40 engine is 160 horsepower, so it is not a high-performance airplane. 6131 states that you must receive and log ground and flight training in a high-performance airplane and receive a one-time endorsement from a flight instructor in order to be qualified to fly a high-performance airplane. Let's just take a quick look at FAR Part 6131 for type ratings and additional training and authorization requirements. It states that type ratings are required for a person who acts as PIC of any of the following aircraft: large aircraft, turbojet-powered airplanes, other aircraft specified by the administrator, and authorization in lieu of a type rating. A person may be authorized to operate without a type rating for up to 60 days, an aircraft requiring a type rating provided that the administrator has authorized the flight or series of flights. The administrator has determined that an equivalent level of safety can be achieved through operating limitations on the authorization, and the person shows that compliance with paragraph A of this section is impracticable for the flight or series of flights. Then it goes on to list some more requirements. Let's scroll down to find the requirements for a complex airplane. Additional training required for operating complex airplanes. Except as provided in paragraph E2 of this section, no person may act as a pilot in command of a complex airplane unless a person has received and logged ground and flight training from an authorized instructor in a complex airplane or in a full flight simulator or flight training device that is representative of a complex airplane and has been found proficient in the operation and systems of the airplane, and received a one-time endorsement in the pilot's logbook from an authorized instructor who certifies the person as proficient to operate a complex airplane. So you can see this is all legal language. These are regulations, federal aviation regulations, so it can be sometimes difficult to follow, but that's pretty straightforward. FAR Part 6139 lists all the requirements that you need to satisfy to be qualified as a private pilot. They include passing the FAA knowledge test, which once you pass is good for 24 months, passing the practical test, which includes an oral examination of knowledge as well as a flight test, acquire the required hours. Part 61 lists all of the hours that you need and the specific type of hours you need to qualify for the check ride. Receive an endorsement from your flight instructor saying that you are ready for the check ride. And you must complete an Airman Application Form 8710. It's important for you to determine whether your flight training was conducted under Part 61 or another part, for example Part 141, because that will dictate some of the requirements to be qualified for the check ride. MTSU's flight school is a Part 141 flight school. Because of that, the minimum number of hours to be qualified for the private pilot check ride is reduced from 40 hours under Part 61 to 35 hours under Part 141. Federal Aviation Regulations Part 6157 lists all of the recent flight experience requirements to operate as pilot in command. Once you get your private pilot's license, it never expires, but you do need to stay current by meeting certain requirements listed in FAR Part 6157. If you are carrying passengers, within the last 90 days, you must have performed at least 3 takeoffs and landings in the category, class, and type of aircraft if a type rating is required. And in order to fly passengers at night, you must also achieve 3 landings to a full stop within the preceding 90 days at night, which is defined as 1 hour after sunset and 1 hour before sunrise. Federal Aviation Regulations Part 67 lists all the medical standards that you are required to satisfy in order to be issued a FAA medical certificate. These are standards that the FAA aviation medical examiners must check in order to issue you the different classes of medical certificates. And the requirements vary based on the type of medical certificate. So to qualify for a Class 1 medical certificate, you may have to satisfy more stringent requirements than if you just need a FAA Class 3 medical certificate. And those differences are listed in FAR Part 67. Federal Aviation Regulations Part 71 is a description of all of different airspace in the National Airspace System in the United States. You will need to be familiar with the description of all of the different classes of airspace that you'll be operating in as a private pilot. But Part 91 lists all of the operating rules within those different classes of airspace. Part 91 of the Federal Aviation Regulations describe the operating rules that you will need to know in order to operate as a private pilot in the National Airspace System. These are probably the most important rules for you to know as a private pilot. FAR Part 91.3 is about your authority and responsibility as the pilot in command. The pilot in command has final authority over a flight and is directly responsible for the flight. In an emergency, the PIC may deviate from any regulation, and if a deviation occurs, the FAA may request a written report. But a written report is not required in all situations, only if the FAA requests a written report. As I said before, it's important for you to understand how to look up these regulations if you ever have questions. So let's just take a quick look at that Federal Aviation Regulation. So that would be Part 91. So let's scroll down to Part 91. And that's General Operating Rules. Then we'll look down for Responsibility and Authority as Pilot in Command at 91.3. And you can see here exactly what we described. Responsibility and authority of the pilot in command. The pilot in command of an aircraft is directly responsible for and is the final authority as to the operation of that aircraft. In an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the pilot in command may deviate from any rule of this part to the extent required to meet that emergency. Each pilot in command who deviates from a rule under the paragraph B of this section shall, upon request of the administrator, send a written report of that deviation to the administrator. FAR Part 91.7 and 91.403 lists requirements for aircraft airworthiness. It describes who is responsible for maintaining an aircraft and who is responsible for determining if the aircraft is airworthy for each flight. So who's responsible for maintaining an aircraft? Is it the PIC or is it the operator of the aircraft? Let's look at Part 91.7 first, Civil Aircraft Airworthiness. No person may operate a civil aircraft unless it is in an airworthy condition. The pilot in command of a civil aircraft is responsible for determining whether that aircraft is in a condition for safe flight. The pilot in command shall discontinue the flight when unairworthy mechanical, electrical, or structural conditions occur. Now let's look at Part 91.403. Part 91.403 are general rules. The owner or operator of an aircraft is primarily responsible for maintaining that aircraft in an airworthy condition, including compliance with Part 39 of this chapter. So the answer to this question, who is responsible for maintaining the aircraft as necessary, is the operator or the owner-operator. Who is responsible for determining the aircraft is in an airworthy condition for each flight? The PIC, or the pilot in command. FAR Part 91.15 are rules about dropping objects from an airplane. Yes, you can drop objects from your airplane. So let's take a look at Part 91.15, dropping objects. No pilot in command of a civil aircraft may allow any object to be dropped from that aircraft in flight that creates a hazard to persons or property. However, this section does not prohibit the dropping of any object if reasonable precautions are taken to avoid injury or damage to persons or property. FAR Part 91.17 describes the rules and regulations that apply to alcohol and flying. There are two basic rules. One is 8 hours between drinking and flying, so you can not fly an airplane if you've been drinking within 8 hours. Your blood alcohol content must be below 0.04. And if you look at Part 91.17, you'll also notice a general rule. So let's take a closer look at Part 91.17. No person may act or attempt to act as a crew member of a civil aircraft within 8 hours after the consumption of any alcoholic beverage, or while under the influence of alcohol. And then it goes on to list the blood alcohol content, but while under the influence of alcohol is the general rule or catch-all. So even if you haven't been drinking within 8 hours, if you are still under the influence of alcohol, this rule still prohibits you from flying an aircraft. Part 91.103 is one of the most important rules for you to know and understand. Part 91.103 is required pre-flight action. So it lists specifically what you must do as the PIC before you start on a flight. The rules of Part 91.103 depend on the nature of the flight that you're about to take. If you're just planning to stay local, in other words, you're just going up in the traffic pattern at your local airport to practice takeoffs and landings, and you're not going to any other destination, then the rules are different than a flight to another airport. If you are just staying local, the only rule that you need to follow is to know the runway lengths of the airport that you're about to fly at, and also you must calculate takeoff and landing distance for that day. If you are about to fly to another airport, then there is additional requirements. You need to know about the weather reports and forecasts for your flight. You need to calculate fuel requirements. You have to know about alternate airports in case you don't make it to your destination. And you also have to know about any known traffic delays through air traffic control. Part 91, 105, and 107 is about seatbelts and shoulder harnesses. The rules differ for crew members and passengers. Crew members, while at their stations during a takeoff and landing, must wear the seatbelt and shoulder harnesses if equipped. If you have passengers, you are required as PIC to show them how to operate the seatbelts and shoulder harnesses. FAR Part 91-105 specifically states during takeoff and landing and while en route, each required flight crew member shall be at the crew member station unless absence is necessary to perform duties in connection with the operation of the aircraft or in connection with physiological needs, and keep the safety belt fastened while at the crew member station. Each required flight crew member of a U.S. registered civil aircraft shall, during takeoff and landing, keep his or her shoulder harness fastened while at his or her assigned duty station. And that paragraph doesn't apply if the seat at the crew member station is not equipped with a shoulder harness, or the crew member would be unable to perform required duties with the shoulder harness fastened. Let's take a close look at 91-107, which applies to passengers. Unless otherwise authorized by the administrator, no pilot may take off a U.S. registered civil aircraft, except a free balloon that incorporates a basket or gondola, or an airship type certificated before November 2, 1987, unless the pilot in command of that aircraft ensures that each person on board is briefed on how to fasten and unfasten that person's safety belt, and if installed, shoulder harnesses. No pilot may cause to be moved on the surface, take off or land a U.S. registered civil aircraft, unless the pilot in command of that aircraft ensures that each person on board has been notified to fasten his or her safety belt, and if installed, his or her shoulder harness. Except as provided in this paragraph, each person on board a U.S. registered civil aircraft must occupy an approved seat or berth with a safety belt, and if installed, shoulder harness properly secured about her or him during movement on the surface, takeoff, and landing. So the seatbelt is required for passengers while taxiing on the surface, for takeoff and landing. During cruise, it's not required. The Federal Aviation Regulation 91-111 is about operating near other aircraft. There are specific rules for operating near other aircraft. This applies to pilots who are planning on doing formation flying. 91-111 states that you cannot fly so close as to create a collision hazard with other aircraft, and you cannot fly in formation unless both PICs or all of the PICs agree prior to the flight. Formation flight is not allowed with passengers. Some very important rules for you to understand are right-of-way rules, and those are covered in FAR Part 91-113. You can also see more detail about these rules in the textbook in Chapter 4. On page 4-7 in the textbook, you'll find the specific right-of-way rules. One of the most important right-of-way rules is that an aircraft in distress has the right-of-way over all other aircraft. So if you declare an emergency, you have the right-of-way over all other aircraft. Those aircraft are required to get out of your way. Also, a general rule regarding converging aircraft of different categories is that the least maneuverable aircraft has the right-of-way over all other aircraft. So if you're flying in a balloon, because your aircraft is not as maneuverable as an airplane, you have the right-of-way over an airplane. And one more rule that's important for you to remember: when two aircraft of the same category are converging, but not head-on, the aircraft to the left shall give way. If the aircraft are on a head-on collision course, both aircraft should turn to the right to avoid collision. Part 91.117 describes airspeed restrictions. Yes, there are speed limits for airplanes. The maximum speed below 10,000 feet is no greater than 250 knots, or 288 miles per hour. Within 4 nautical miles of a Class D or Class C airport below 2,000 feet AGL, or above ground level, the speed limit is 200 knots, or 230 miles per hour. Now, these are important for you to remember, not so much because of the airplanes that you'll be flying, but when you do get to the point in your career where you're flying jets, these are very important restrictions for you to know. Part 91.119 describes minimum safe altitudes for operating in the National Airspace System. You can find details about these rules in the textbook in Chapter 4, page 4-8. As a general rule, anywhere, an altitude allowing, if a power unit fails, an emergency landing without undue hazards to persons or property on the surface. So, generally speaking, if you're flying anywhere, you need to be in an altitude that will allow you to land without endangering people on the surface or property on the surface. And then there are 2 specific rules, one for congested areas and one for uncongested areas. Over congested areas, you need to maintain an altitude 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle and within 2,000 feet of that obstacle from the aircraft. If you're in an other than congested area, an altitude of 500 feet above the surface, except over open water or sparsely populated areas. In those cases, the aircraft may not be operated closer than 500 feet to any person, vessel, vehicle, or structure. Part 91.121 describes the rules for altimeter settings. Remember, when you're flying cross-country from one area to another, the pressure can change, so it's important for you to keep a current altimeter setting in your altimeter. Part 91.121 requires you to have a current altimeter setting from a station within 100 nautical miles. But what if one is not available? Well, you can get an altimeter setting from a flight service station, from EFOS and Route Flight Advisory Service on frequency 121.0. So it's very important for you to have a current altimeter setting to ensure that your altimeter is accurate. Part 91.125 lists the different light signals that the control tower may use if you should lose your radios at a controlled airport. So it's important for you to know these light signals just in case you should lose your radios while you're flying at a controlled airport. The different colors signify different meanings. Each color and type of signal has a different meaning depending on the location of the aircraft. In other words, a signal may mean something if you're on the surface and something different if you're in flight. For example, a light gun signal of steady red if you're on the ground means stop, but if you're in flight it means give way to other aircraft and continue circling. Federal Aviation Regulations Part 91.151 describe minimum fuel requirements. Minimum fuel requirements differ based on the type of flight and the time of day that the flight will occur. As a private pilot, you'll be certified for VFR flight, so we'll just go over those rules. If you're flying VFR during the day, you're required to have enough fuel in the tanks to get to your destination, plus another 30 minutes of flying. So when you land at your destination, you should have at least another 30 minutes of fuel in your tanks. For a VFR flight at night, the requirement is 45 minutes of reserve fuel. MTSU requires at least 1 hour of reserve fuel for all flights. Let's look at an example of a day flight VFR from Murfreesboro to Knoxville in an MTSU airplane. we estimate that the flight will take 1.2 hours and the fuel flow will be 9 gallons per hour. So if we're flying an MTSU plane, how much fuel must we have? What's our minimum fuel? Well, if we're burning 9 gallons an hour, we'll burn 10.8 gallons in 1.2 hours. MTSU requires us to have enough fuel to fly to our destination plus another hour. If we fly another hour, that'll be 9 gallons of additional fuel. So our minimum fuel for this flight would be 10.8 gallons plus the 9 gallons of reserve fuel for a total of 19.8 gallons. Federal Aviation Regulations Part 91-153 describe the information that must be included in a VFR flight plan. VFR flight plans are not required, but they're highly recommended, because if something should happen to your flight and you don't arrive at your destination within a half hour of your estimated time of arrival, the flight service station will initiate search and rescue efforts. If you don't file a VFR flight plan, it may take a while before anyone notices that you're missing. Let's take a look at the information in Part 91-153. Information required. Unless otherwise authorized by ATC, each person filing a VFR flight plan shall include the following information: the aircraft identification number, and if necessary, a radio call sign, the type of aircraft, the full name and address of the pilot, the point and the proposed time of departure, the proposed route and cruising altitude, true airspeed, and the point of first intended landing, estimated elapsed time until over that point, and the amount of fuel on board in hours, the number of persons in the aircraft, and any other information the pilot in command or ATC believes is necessary for air traffic control purposes. Federal Aviation Regulations Part 91-155 describe basic VFR weather minimums. We covered these in a previous module on airspace, but it's important for you to know these minimums as a VFR pilot, because since they are regulations, it's illegal to violate these minimums. As a VFR pilot flying around Murfreesboro, more often than not you'll be flying in Class Echo airspace. And the VFR minimums in Class Echo airspace at the altitudes you'll be flying at in the Diamond DA-40 or any other general aviation aircraft are at least a 3 statute mile visibility and clearance from clouds at least 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontal. Federal Aviation Regulations Part 91-159 describe VFR cruising altitude requirements. VFR cruising altitude requirements differ depending on the direction of flight. So let's look at a flight from Murfreesboro to Memphis, VFR. What would the appropriate cruising altitude be? If you will be cruising on an westerly course, you must maintain an altitude equal to an even 1,000 plus 500. So that would be 4,500, 6,500, or 8,500. If you are maintaining an easterly course, then you must maintain an altitude of an odd 1,000 plus 500. So instead of 4,500, you should maintain an altitude of 5,500, or 7,500, or now 9,500. So on a flight from Murfreesboro to Memphis, that would be a westerly heading. And so we should maintain an even 1,000 plus 500 on a VFR flight. So an appropriate altitude would either be 4,500 or 6,500 feet. Federal Aviation Regulations Part 91-203 describe the airplane documents that you must have in the aircraft in order to be legal. And you may remember the acronym AERO, A-R-R-O-W. You must have an airworthiness certificate, a registration certificate. If you're flying outside of the United States, you must have a radio operator's license. You must have an owner's manual, and that owner's manual must include weight and balance information. Federal Aviation Regulations Part 91-205 describe instrument and equipment requirements. And there are a couple of acronyms that you may know to help you remember these instrument requirements. One is A tomato flames for VFR day instrument requirements and equipment requirements. And then for VFR night, in addition to A tomato flames, you could use the acronym FLAPS to remember what's required for a VFR flight at night. So here's the acronym for VFR day equipment. A is for airspeed indicator, T is for a tachometer, O is for oil pressure gauge, M is for manifold pressure gauge, A is for altimeter, T for temperature gauge if it's a water-cooled engine, O is for oil temperature gauge, F is for fuel gauges, and there's another F for flotation devices if you're flying over water. Landing gear position light is L, and then A stands for anti-collision lights, M is for magnetic compass, E is for an emergency locator transmitter, S is for safety belts, and there are two S's. The last one is for safety harnesses if the aircraft is equipped with shoulder harnesses. If you're flying VFR at night, there's additional equipment required, and you can remember that equipment with the acronym FLAPS. F stands for fuses, and you need one spare set or 3 of each type if your aircraft uses fuses. L is for landing light, and landing lights are only required if your aircraft is for hire. So if it's a rental aircraft or it's an aircraft being used in a charter operation, you are required to have a landing light at night. A is for anti-collision lights, P is for position lights, and S is for a source of electrical power, for example, a battery and an alternator. So what if you find some equipment that's not operating? Are you still legal to fly? Well, that's covered in Federal Aviation Regulations Part 91-213. And that's an important regulation number to remember for the test. Whether or not an aircraft is legal to fly with inoperative equipment depends on whether or not the aircraft has a minimum equipment list or not. An MEL is a list of equipment that can be inoperative and still be legal to fly. And it contains procedures that you need to follow if you find inoperative equipment. If your aircraft doesn't have an MEL, there's a 4-step test. First, you must determine if the equipment is required by the type certificate. And that's usually not a concern because the type certificate lists large items like the landing gear, propeller, engine, wings, so that's usually not a concern. The second step is to check whether the equipment is on a kinds of operation list for a particular flight. You can find that in the Pilot's Operating Handbook in the Weight and Balance section. The next step is to determine whether the equipment is required by Federal Aviation Regulation Part 91-205. That's the regulation that we just went over for VFR day and VFR night flight. If it's not required by FAR Part 91-205, then you just have to make sure it's not required by an airworthiness directive. If it's not, then we have to take the following action. The regulations require that if the inoperative equipment is not required, that you remove the equipment and have maintenance adjust the airplane's weight and balance, which is really not the recommended procedure, or deactivate the equipment and place a placard or a sticker on the equipment that says inoperative. If that's done, and a note is placed in the aircraft's maintenance log, the pilot in command then must determine if the flight can continue safely, and if so, you can legally fly. That's the end of the presentation on Federal Aviation Regulations. Our next presentation will be on aviation physiology.